A blood-soaked stranger collapsed behind Cora Ellison's trading post on a snow-choked night, forcing her to choose between locking her door or saving a man who might destroy her world. She didn't know his name, didn't know that his silence carried a deadly secret, or that her single act of mercy would ripple through generations, transforming a lonely store into a sanctuary where broken souls found belonging. This is a story about a woman who opened her door once, and in doing so, created a legacy that would echo long after her final breath. The snow had already started falling by the time Cora Ellison saw the man collapse behind her trading post. At first, she thought he was a shadow moving wrong, a trick of the storm, or the wind shaking the last of the dry branches loose. But then she heard the sound, a low, guttural thud, like meat hitting earth. She stood frozen in the doorway, her hands wrapped tight around the tin cup of weak chicory, watching the blood bloom in the white behind the woodpile. Her first instinct was to lock the door. Her second was to pray. But instead she set the cup down, took a breath, and walked outside. The wind bit hard. The cold was the kind that crawled into your joints and stayed there. She knelt in the snow beside the man, unsure if he was breathing, unsure if she wanted him to be. His coat was dark with blood on the left side, just beneath the ribs. His hair was plastered to his forehead with ice. There was a pistol tucked into the front of his belt, but his hand wasn't on it. His hands were open, palms red, fingers still curled like they hadn't stopped running. Cora touched his neck with 2 fingers. The pulse was there, barely. Her heart raced. She glanced toward the road. Nothing, no riders, no lanterns, no sound except the wind. "I don't know who you are," she whispered, "but you're not dying behind my store." She didn't know where the courage came from. Maybe it was the same stubbornness that had kept her in this place after Matthew died, the same will that made her open the post every morning even when no one came. Maybe it was just the silence and the snow and the shape of a man who looked like he'd been hunted to the edge of the world. She gritted her teeth, hooked her arms under his shoulders, and dragged him inch by inch through the back door. Inside, she lowered him onto the storeroom floor. The fire in the cast-iron stove popped, giving off more noise than heat. She shut the door with her foot and locked it. Then she rolled up her sleeves. She found the wound, pulled the knife from her boot, and cut away his coat. Blood soaked her hands, warm and thick, a reminder that he was alive. She boiled water, poured it into a chipped bowl, and cleaned the wound with shaking fingers. She hadn't stitched flesh since the war, since her father's leg split open on a rail spike, and she'd sewn it shut in a barn lit by lanterns in fear. He didn't wake. Not even when she pushed the needle through, not when she poured whiskey over the bandages, not when she whispered, "You'll live if you stay still. That's all I ask." She sat up against the wall at dawn, exhausted. The snow still fell. The man breathed, shallow and slow. Cora stood, stretched her aching knees, and looked down at him. "I hope you're not who I think you are," she said, "because they'll come for you if you are, and I can't protect you. I'm just one woman." He didn't answer, but she thought his jaw moved, just slightly, as if trying to hold in something too heavy for words. She left the storeroom only to check on the front of the shop. The shelves were sparse: salt, sugar, flour, coffee if you asked nicely. She kept things neat, made notes in the ledger, waited for footsteps that didn't come. It was 3 days before the man opened his eyes. She heard a creak from the back room and dropped the sack of dried beans she was carrying. She moved slowly, cautiously, unsure what kind of man she'd wake to find. He was sitting up, back braced against the wall, blanket falling from his shoulders. His skin was pale, his eyes hollow and rimmed in shadows, but they were awake, and they were watching her. He didn't speak. Cora crossed her arms. "You're in my storeroom. I stitched you up. You lost a lot of blood, but I reckon you'll keep it inside now if you stay still." He nodded once. Slow. "You haven't said a word." Another nod. She frowned. "Can't or won't?" No answer. She sighed, stepped forward, and poured a cup of water from the pitcher. She handed it to him. He took it in both hands and drank. His throat worked visibly. When he finished, he looked up at her, still silent. Cora sat in the chair across from him. "You're not much for explaining yourself," she said. He blinked. "Name?" He didn't answer. "Well, I have to call you something." She studied his face. Sharp cheekbones, mouth drawn into a hard line. A man who'd learned to stay quiet long before he bled out on her floor. "Guess I'll call you Ash," she said. He blinked again. Not quite approval, not quite resistance. "Fitz," she added. "You came out of the fire." He slept more after that. She fed him broth, then bread, then salted pork when he could stomach it. He healed slowly. His silence never changed. But the quiet between them began to. He swept the floor one morning, unasked, reached for the heavy crates when she tried to move them herself, started watching the windows, the road, the tree line, like a man used to danger that didn't knock before it came. Cora didn't press him, but she noticed. He stood taller after a week, walked to the stove on his own after 10 days. On the 12th morning, he brought in wood from the shed without being asked. She cooked eggs that day, real ones, gave him the bigger portion. He nodded his thanks. "Glad to see you upright," she said. He looked at her, then at the window. The silence stretched, and finally he spoke. Cora. Just her name. But the sound of it, rough, dry, real, sent something through her chest she couldn't name. She set her fork down. "You knew?" He nodded. "How?" He swallowed. "Trading post, Ellison widow." She narrowed her eyes. "You've been here before?" "No." He paused, then added, "They talk." Cora stared at him. "Who talks?" "Riders. Men looking." Her breath caught. "For you?" He didn't answer, but his jaw flexed. And she knew. "What did you do?" "Didn't," he said. 2 syllables. And yet they said more than most paragraphs. She believed him. She didn't know why. She just did. Ash became a fixture. He said little, ate what she made, repaired the roof, built a new shelf for the dry goods, watched the world like it owed him a reckoning. And she let him. Not because she needed help, but because she needed someone who knew how to be quiet without turning it into absence. The snow melted. Spring came slow, hesitant, like a child approaching a fire it wasn't sure wouldn't burn. The road thawed. Foot traffic picked up. A rider came in one afternoon, his boots too clean, his eyes too sharp. He looked around the store and said, "I'm looking for a man. Calls himself Ash." Cora didn't blink. "Doesn't ring any bells," she said. The man tapped the counter with a gloved finger. "He's wanted. For murder." Cora tilted her head. "A lot of men are wanted for murder. Doesn't mean they did it." The rider smiled without warmth. "You'd know if he passed through." She stared at him. Maybe. He tipped his hat and left. Ash stepped out from the back a minute later. She met his eyes. "You need to run?" He shook his head. "I'm done running." She poured coffee, handed him a cup. "Then I guess we stay." And they did. Summer brought heat that cracked the earth in wide seams and made the walls of the trading post sweat. The days were longer, the road busier. Men rode in with heavy boots and sunburned hands, looking for grain, nails, tobacco, news. Most stayed only long enough to take what they needed and nod at Cora in passing. A few lingered, curious about the man in the corner, who rarely spoke but always watched, who moved like a wolf on the edge of the firelight. Present, quiet, unreadable. Ash spoke more now, but only to her. At night, when the door was bolted and the lamps turned low, he would sit across the table from Cora, sleeves rolled, a cup of water in his hand, his voice low and spare. He told her small things. About a mule he'd once kept that liked to bite the backs of other animals' legs, about the smell of early morning on a ridge no one ever named, about the way you could tell the truth about a man by how he handled hunger. She listened, never interrupted, never pushed. He never told her everything, but he told her enough. She told him things too, though fewer. About Matthew, about the winter she buried him, about the child they lost before they ever had a chance to know it. She told him about the night she almost left. "I packed everything in the wagon," she said one night, her voice brittle as the dry summer grass. "Left a note for no one. I was halfway down the road before I stopped. I kept thinking, I have nothing here but a store with bare shelves and a fire that won't hold." Ash didn't speak. She looked up. "So why'd I stay?" He answered without pause, "Because the story wasn't done yet." She didn't cry, but her hands trembled. That week, a man came through town with a name that stopped Ash mid-step. "Mercer," he said. Cora was shelving canned peaches when she heard the name. The jar slipped in her fingers, but didn't fall. Ash was already outside by the time she reached the front of the store. The man was tall, his beard graying at the edges, his voice too smooth. He leaned against the post like he belonged there, like he owned the road, the dirt, the sky above it. Cora stepped beside Ash. The man raised his brow. "This your place?" Ash didn't answer. The man looked her over. "You must be the widow." She said nothing. He pushed off the post and stepped forward. "I'm looking for someone," he said. "Goes by Ash, but he was born Aaron Coulter." Cora felt Ash go still beside her. Mercer grinned. "Heard he's living quiet somewhere he doesn't belong. Heard he's pretending to be a nobody. Trouble is, he's not. Heir to the Coulter spread, 400 acres, 2 rivers, a mine in the hills. Only problem? They think he killed his brother." Cora's heart pounded. Mercer leaned in. "I know he didn't, because I did." Ash moved fast, faster than she'd ever seen. One second Mercer was grinning. The next, he was pinned against the wall, Ash's forearm against his throat, his feet barely touching the ground. "You should have stayed dead," Ash growled. Mercer laughed, a wet, broken sound. "You don't have the stomach." Ash's grip tightened. Cora stepped forward. "Ash, don't." He didn't move, but his eyes flicked to her, just once. Then he let go. Mercer crumpled to the ground, coughing, gasping. "You come back here again," Ash said, "and I'll finish what you started." Cora turned to the man on the ground. "Go." He did. When the dust settled and the road was empty again, she reached for Ash's hand. He didn't let go. That night, Ash told her everything. About the Coulter land, the inheritance, the jealousy. The night his brother died in a fire that Mercer lit, and Ash tried too late to stop. About the fear, the shame, the silence. "I thought if I stayed quiet long enough," he said, "the past would forget me." Cora shook her head. "It never does." He looked at her. "But maybe it can forgive," she said, "if you let it." And so they stayed. Ash sent word to a lawyer. Papers were filed. A claim was reopened. Witnesses, long silent, came forward. Mercer vanished into the wind. 6 months later, a letter arrived. The estate was Ash's now. The land, the house, the mine, all of it. Cora read the letter, then looked at Ash. He held it over the stove flame. Watched it burn. She stared. "You don't want it?" "I have what I want." He looked at her, at the store, at the walls he'd helped fix, and the shelves he'd helped fill. "Here," he said, "this is home." And it was. That winter they married. No guests, no preacher, just a promise spoken by firelight, sealed with the soft press of hands over a table scarred by work and love. The road outside filled with snow, the shelves filled with goods, and Cora, once timid, once ready to run, stood behind her counter with Ash beside her, her hands steady, her voice sure. When children came, 3 in all, they knew the story, grew up with it in their bones, of the man who didn't speak until he did, of the widow who said yes when she could have said no, of the love that healed without asking for permission. They kept the store. They kept the land. They kept the silence that no longer hurt, and the words that came only when needed, because they didn't have gold. They didn't need it. They had something else. They had each other, and they had the quiet kind of love that stays. The first child was born in spring, just as the trading post began to smell again of lilacs and leather. Her name was June, after the month Cora first heard Ash speak. After the season the road turned soft again, and men began passing through with coin and stories and the sweat of long travel on their brows. She was a quiet baby, rarely crying, her eyes following Ash as if she already understood the weight he carried in silence. Ash built her cradle himself, smoothing the joints of hickory until they felt like river stones. He lined it with lamb's wool, then tucked one of Cora's old shawls into the corner like a prayer. They didn't talk much about what it meant to raise a child at the edge of everything. They just did it. Cora ran the post just as she always had, but now with a baby on her hip and a man at her side who never had to be asked to do what needed doing. Ash carried flour sacks without being told, repaired hinges before they creaked, chopped firewood in long, even strokes that made the watching men nod with quiet approval. He didn't boast. He didn't preach. He just stayed. When June took her first steps, it was in the back room where Ash had once bled out on the floor. He was the one who caught her, arms outstretched, as she stumbled toward him with a grin that split her face in two. He lifted her gently, pressed his forehead to hers, and didn't say a word. Cora stood in the doorway and smiled. The years that followed came like a story unfolding line by line. June grew tall and serious. She asked questions with her eyes before she asked them with her mouth. She sat on Ash's knee at the end of every day, listening as he read aloud from the old books Cora kept stacked by the stove. Accounts of travels and justice, poems with dirt under their nails. 2 more children followed, Henry, then Ruth. Henry was all elbows and laughter, his hair wild as a colt's mane, always running barefoot, always one breath away from mischief. Ruth was gentler, quiet like June, but with Cora's fierce heart. She learned to tie knots before she could read, and once sat a full hour in silence beside a wounded bird just to make sure it didn't die alone. Ash adored them all in his own way, without grand declarations, but with presence. He taught June how to track a trail without snapping a twig, how to listen to the land. He showed Henry how to sharpen a blade, how to mend leather. He let Ruth fall asleep on his shoulder during storms, even when his old wound ached from the cold. The townsfolk came to accept them slowly. They watched Cora transform from the quiet widow behind the counter to the matriarch of something larger. They saw the way she stood beside Ash without flinching when men asked if he was the Coulter boy who vanished. They saw the way Ash never once claimed the Coulter land, not even after the courts cleared his name and handed him papers bearing his rightful title. He gave it all away, sold the mine, donated the land to a homestead trust. Don't need it, he told the lawyer. Have what matters. He never left the trading post again. The store became more than a place for bartering goods. It became a place where men left burdens they couldn't carry past the door, where travelers found shelter from storms, where lost souls found directions, not always to a town, but to a quieter life. Cora planted a garden behind the post, taught the children to weed between the rows. Ash built a bench from an old wagon axle and placed it beneath the cottonwood tree that shaded the east corner. It became his place. He sat there in the evenings with a cup of water or a child in his lap, eyes scanning the horizon, not in fear anymore, but in reverence. And when the rare rider came through with suspicion in his eyes, Ash met him with stillness. They always looked away first, because there's something stronger than a pistol, stronger than a name cleared in court. It's a man with nothing to prove and a family he'd burn the world to protect. One summer, a former deputy from the territory capital came through, claiming he was writing a book. He asked Ash for an interview. Ash shook his head. "I'm not the story," he said. The man turned to Cora. "Then who is?" She answered without hesitation, "The people who stayed." By the time June turned 20, she was running the front of the store on her own. Henry rode deliveries out to nearby farms. Ruth had taken to carving, whittling pews and handles, and small figurines of birds and buffalo that they sold on a shelf labeled simply Ruth's. Ash's beard had gone silver. Cora had laugh lines deeper than the one dirt road that led to their door. And every night they sat on that bench. Sometimes they spoke. Often they didn't need to. They understood the world in ways only survivors could. And they had nothing left to prove. Just love. Steady, deliberate, earned. Cora wrote a single line in her ledger the day Ash died. It read, "He came in silence. He stayed in strength. He left in peace." She buried him beneath the cottonwood he'd planted from seed the year Ruth was born. No stone, just his boots set beside the roots. Every Sunday after, she read aloud to the children from the books he loved. And when she grew too tired to run the post, June took over. The sign never changed. But the story grew. Riders still passed. Storms still came. And behind the counter stood a girl who had once been carried in the arms of a silent outlaw and taught to speak truth with gentleness. When asked how it all began, she'd smile and say, "With a woman who opened her door, and a man who stayed." And that was enough. It always had been. Years passed, and the road changed. It widened in places, narrowed in others. Trees grew where there once was prairie, and prairie swallowed fences that had once marked lines between neighbors. The towns got bigger to the south and quieter to the west. But the trading post stood as it always had, low-roofed, timber-framed, a stove always warm, and the scent of earth and coffee and leather clinging to every plank. Cora lived longer than anyone expected her to. She stayed sharp until the end, watching from the same stool behind the counter as her grandchildren grew tall, learned to measure flour, count inventory, keep records in ledgers that still bore her handwriting in the early pages. She stopped carrying heavy sacks. She stopped sweeping the front step, but she never stopped reading people when they walked through the door. One afternoon, as a boy no older than 16 stood in the doorway with hunger in his eyes and no boots on his feet, she looked up from her chair and simply said, "You're safe here." And he stayed, like so many others, like Ash had. When she passed, June buried her beside Ash, just beyond the cottonwood tree, near the spot where he used to sit at dusk and trace the horizon with his eyes. There was no service, no songs, just the family gathered quietly, hands folded, tears tucked into sun-warmed collars. Ruth carved a wooden plaque and planted it between the two graves. It read, "Cora Ellison." She opened her door and never closed her heart. Below it, smaller, Ash Coulter. He needed a place, and became one. They didn't speak much after. But that night Henry lit the fire in the stove and stayed up reading from the oldest journal they kept behind the counter, the one that still smelled faintly of old ash and peppermint oil. He read the first passage aloud. "I found him half dead behind the woodpile. He never said a word. But something in me knew he was supposed to be here, and I'd been waiting for something to remind me I was alive." The store kept going. People kept coming. Some only stayed long enough to eat and buy sugar and pass along gossip. Others asked for work. Some didn't even ask. They just stayed and gave back, nailing down shingles, sweeping floors, fixing broken hinges, one favor at a time. June taught them all what she'd been taught. Work quietly, speak kindly, listen more than you talk, and leave the world better than you found it. The Coulter name, once whispered as outlaw and scandal, came to mean something else entirely. It meant steadiness. It meant honesty. It meant someone would always be home. The trading post became a place where people sent letters they didn't know how to write, where travelers dropped off coins for people they hadn't met, where birth announcements hung on the wall next to wedding ribbons and the names of the dead. One spring, June's daughter Elsie found an old tin box beneath the floorboards in the back room. Infilled was a folded slip of paper, brittle with age. In faded ink it read, "For the next one who needs to know where they belong." There was no name on it, just a drawing, a circle around the trading post, with the word "home" written in small script at the center. She showed it to June. They didn't say anything. They just placed it beneath the glass of the front counter, between the hand-carved soap and the peppermint sticks, so everyone who passed through could see it. Over the years, Elsie took over most of the work. She wasn't a loud woman, but she had a way of making you feel seen when she looked at you. Her hands moved fast and sure when she counted change or lifted a sack of grain. She knew where every tool was kept. She knew how to calm a skittish horse and how to read a man's fear before he spoke it. She wore Ash's old coat in the winter and Cora's brooch on her collar. When a man from the railroad company offered to buy the land, triple its worth, she looked at the contract, smiled, and said, "It's not for sale." He didn't understand. But that wasn't her fault. She sat under the cottonwood that night, her fingers pressed to the plaque her aunt had carved, and wrote in her journal, "They tried to buy what was never for sale." How do you explain a place like this to men who think land is only valuable if it can be cleared or counted? This land has held grief and forgiveness and second chances and morning light for 200 years. There's no number for that, only names, only staying. Each generation added to the journals, not every day, but often enough. Some entries were short, fed 3 travelers. One gave me an orange ribbon, one left a poem. One cried and said nothing. I let them. Others were longer, like the one Henry's grandson wrote the day he returned from war, still limping, still dreaming in gunfire. I couldn't speak when I got home, not for a week. But Ruth's carving knife was still sharp, the stove still clicked when it cooled, the bread still rose, the porch swing creaked. And for the first time in a long time, I remembered what it felt like to be a whole person. I didn't need to talk. The house already remembered me. Eventually, they started calling it the place. Not the Coulter Post, not the Ellison store, just the place. People knew what it meant. It meant someone would hold the door if you were late. It meant you didn't need a reason to sit by the fire. It meant that even if you came empty, you'd leave with something. One fall, Elsie's daughter Miriam asked her if she thought Ash and Cora had ever imagined all this. Elsie laughed. "No, but they did something better." "What's that?" "They made it possible." And so it continued. The walls got painted, the shelves replaced, the journals filled, the porch rebuilt, the hearth retiled. But the core, the beating heart of it, never changed. It was in every quiet act, every meal shared, every silence honored, every name remembered, every time someone asked, "Can I stay?" And the answer always was, yes. In time, the trading post was no longer just a dot on a hand-drawn map or a weather-worn building at the end of a dirt road. It became something deeper, something people spoke of like a breath they'd forgotten to take until they got there. Word spread like wildfire whispered down the wind. If you were lost, if you were tired, if you didn't know where else to go, you went to the place. It wasn't always easy to find, and it didn't try to be. There were no signs posted beyond the old hand-painted plank that read, "Supplies, rest, respect." But people found it. They always did. A girl from the city came one summer, shoulders too thin and eyes rimmed in makeup that had long since stopped trying to hide what needed hiding. She asked if she could sweep the porch. She stayed 3 months, left with a hand-carved necklace from Ruth's grandson and a promise to keep going. An old preacher passed through on his way to nowhere and wept when he saw the cottonwood. He said, I once baptized a boy under a tree like this. Never saw him again. He left behind a song. It hung in the air like a prayer for days. Children grew up there. Some were born on purpose, others arrived by chance. No one asked for lineage. No one asked for names until they were offered. What mattered was that you pulled your weight, kept your word, and listened when someone said they were breaking but didn't know how to fall. Miriam wrote that. She kept the journals now. Her mother, Elsie, had passed quietly in the night with the fire burning low and her hands folded over the last entry she ever wrote. The shelves are full. The road is quiet. The dog is old, but still dreams in his sleep. I hear Cora sometimes when the wind moves just right. I think she's proud. I know I am. Tomorrow, I'll teach Miriam how to record the weights. Tonight I'll rest. Miriam had cried when she read it, not because it hurt, but because it felt like a torch passed in gentle hands. She made no speeches. She just opened the next journal and wrote. The work continues. She told the story the way it had always been told, not in grand gestures, but in meals made and fires stoked and moments noticed. She planted onions near the side wall, hung garlic over the windows, mended a patch in the roof with tin someone had carved a name into decades before. Visitors asked, "Why keep the journals?" She would smile, "Because no one is forgotten if they're written down." One day, she pulled the very first book from the shelf, its spine frayed, its pages brittle as old leaves. She turned carefully to a passage from Cora herself. He never looked me in the eye when he arrived, not until I gave him water. Then he did, and I saw something in that look that I still don't have words for. Maybe I never will, but I know this. He needed to stay, and something in me needed to let him. She copied that page into the newest journal, then wrote, "Let him stay. Let them all stay." That is how we built this, one yes at a time. Years later, Miriam's son grew into a man who could lift grain sacks with ease but never raised his voice. He had Cora's eyes. He had Ash's hands. He married a woman who carved her name into the bench under the cottonwood and sang songs to the hens at sunrise. When they had a daughter, they named her June, not for the month, but for the girl who had taken her first steps on the old storeroom floor and built a life with her mother's backbone and her father's stillness. That new June found the journals young. She flipped through them like sacred texts, not in reverence, but in awe. She laughed at the scribbled margins, the recipes gone wrong, the poem about the dog who kept stealing socks. She pressed flowers between the pages and asked endless questions. She was the one who finally wrote down Ash's full story, pieced together from old notes, folded letters, side comments in the margins. She wrote, "His name was Ash Coulter. They said he was an outlaw. They said he was dangerous. They were wrong. He was hurting. He was hunted. And he came here, and we did not turn him away. And now we are here because of it." On the 100th anniversary of Ash's death, June stood beneath the cottonwood, the journals stacked high on a table beside her, and read that passage aloud. The wind picked up then. The leaves moved, and a blossom, just one, fell from the tree, even though it was late autumn. She picked it up, pressed it between the newest pages, and began writing again. Because the story wasn't finished. It never would be. Not as long as someone opened the door. Not as long as someone stayed. Another year passed, and the seasons turned just as they always had. The winds grew cold again, and the days shortened until dawn and dusk felt almost one and the same. In the evenings, the hearth in the trading post flickered against the walls, the orange light dancing across the shelves filled with flour, oats, soap, and stories. June, the newest June, was 17 when she took over the daily journal. Her handwriting was clean, her words careful but brave. She did not hesitate to record the truth, even when it was small or hard. She wrote about the weather, about the harvest, about the time the door blew open in the middle of the night and let in a snowstorm that dusted the counter with frost. She wrote about the stray cat that had taken to curling beside the stove, about a boy named Lucas, who'd arrived from the canyon trails with a bruised jaw and silent tears, and about how he'd eventually found his voice while fixing the barn roof. She didn't try to write like the others, she wrote like herself. Her first full entry read, "I don't know what it feels like to be alone. I've never known, because I was born here, because I was born to the story. I've eaten at this table since before I had teeth. I've slept beneath the quilt my grandmother sewed by candlelight. I've read every journal on this shelf more than once, and still every day feels new, because this place teaches you that healing never repeats the same way twice, the same as love, the same as staying." And then, one morning in early spring, the road brought someone new. His name was Nathaniel. He came with a quiet horse and a pack full of sketchbooks. He didn't say much, but he looked around the store like he'd found something he didn't know he'd lost. He paid for bread with a silver button. He fixed a broken latch on the back door before anyone asked. And that night, he sat on the steps of the porch beside June and said, "I think I was supposed to come here." She nodded. Most people were. He stayed. Not forever at first, just long enough to help with the fence line and paint the eaves. But each time he packed to leave, he'd linger, stand by the cottonwood, touch the carving in the bench that read, "Ash was here," and then he'd unpack again. Eventually, he didn't pack at all. He brought more sketchbooks. Drew the trading post by moonlight, drew the stove, the shelves, the cottonwood, and the rows of boot prints that led to and from the porch. He drew June, though she didn't know until she found the picture pressed between the pages of a book he'd left behind on the counter. She never mentioned it, just tucked it between the journals and wrote, "He sees this place the way I feel it. That might be the beginning of something." By summer, Nathaniel and June were walking the trails together. By fall, they were fixing fence posts and sharing coffee before sunrise. And by the first snowfall, she told him she loved him, not in a whisper, not in a rush, but in a voice full of certainty that stopped the wind just long enough for him to hear it. He didn't speak right away. He took her hand, kissed her palm, and nodded. They were married the next spring under the cottonwood. It bloomed early that year. The whole family came, some by blood, many by history. Every bench was filled. Children sat in laps. Old hands clutched canes and shoulders. The dog barked once during the vows, and no one minded. They didn't speak vows written by strangers. They spoke lines pulled from the journals. Nathaniel said, "You gave me more than rest. You gave me a reason to stop running." June said, "You stayed. That was all I ever needed." Their names were added to the wall beneath the sign. Their story folded into the ledger. Their love became part of the map no one ever redrew because it never needed changing. That summer, they built a new loft in the barn for the children they hoped would come. They planted lavender by the windows. They framed one of Ash's old shirts and hung it beside Cora's apron. And June wrote, "This story keeps blooming, not because of luck, not because of gold, because someone always chooses to say yes, because someone always chooses to stay, because even when we're tired, even when we don't know the way forward, we build another fire. We open another journal. We hold the door open for someone who hasn't yet found their voice." And she was right. The story never ended. It just turned another page and waited. Years after June and Nathaniel married beneath the cottonwood, their children ran barefoot through the same tall grass that had once hidden Ash's trail of blood. No one spoke of it with fear anymore. That part of the story had long since been woven into the fabric of the place, not as something to mourn, but something to remember, something that proved redemption wasn't only for the saved, but for the willing. Their eldest, a boy named Caleb, was 6 the first time he asked about the journals. He sat on June's lap in the hall of staying, fingers tracing the spine of a book nearly 100 years old. "Who wrote the first one?" he asked. June smiled. "Your great-great-grandmother. Cora. Did she know how to write fancy? She knew how to write true. That night, she let him open a blank page in a thin new book and write his name in blocky, backwards letters. Beneath it, he drew a tree with roots like rivers and a sun that smiled. They kept the page. Every journal from then on began the same way, with the name of the next child, the next keeper, the next one who would know what it meant to be raised inside a story that never let go of its beginnings. The post changed slowly. Nathaniel carved a new sign that read, "Trade, Rest, Belong." They hung it above the door. June expanded the shelves, added a coffee bar where travelers could sit in the morning light with warm mugs and sore feet. No one asked how much the coffee cost. There was a jar on the counter, and people gave what they could. Sometimes it was coins, sometimes it was a ring. Once it was a song. June put them all in the ledger. Years blurred like brushstrokes, and still the story grew. Ruth's great-granddaughter, Mira, came back from a failed marriage in the city with nothing but a box of buttons and a child who wouldn't speak. She took over the sewing table and stayed. Henry's youngest grandson built beehives behind the barn. The honey sold faster than he could bottle it. He married a baker from Tucson who made pies that smelled like memory. And one rainy October afternoon, a young woman arrived with mud on her skirt and a letter in her pocket from a mother she never knew. The letter had 3 lines. They said my father was a bad man. He wasn't. He was just lost. Go to the place. They'll understand. She stayed. No one asked questions. June gave her clean clothes. Nathaniel fixed the heel of her boot. Caleb, now 16, showed her the orchard. That night she sat at the big table, silent for a long while, until finally she whispered, "I've never had a place." June put a bowl of soup in front of her. "You do now." The journals held it all. The arrivals, the departures, the silences, and the songs. One day Caleb brought home a girl with calloused hands and oil-streaked cheeks. She was a mechanic's daughter from downstate. Her laugh rang off the porch walls and made June smile. Caleb introduced her with one sentence. "She reads the journals." That was enough. They married 2 years later, also beneath the cottonwood, beneath the same hand-carved bench that bore initials no one had touched in decades. They didn't need to. It had lasted this long. The wedding guests sat on hay bales. The bride wore boots. June gave them a journal of their own. Caleb's first entry read, "I was born with a name made of stories. I was raised on bread and kindness. I fell in love with someone who understands that a home is not walls. It's staying when the road beckons and the wind tells you to run." She stayed. So I will too. The post weathered another storm that winter. Snow came fast and thick, and the roof of the chicken coop collapsed. Nathaniel threw his back out, repairing it. June burned the bread for the first time in years. But they made it through. They always did. Because even in hardship, the warmth held. Because love, when rooted deep enough, doesn't die in the cold. It strengthens. On the day June passed, Caleb found her in the reading room, the journal open in her lap, her head tilted toward the window, sunlight warm across her face. She'd written one final sentence. Ash came to die, but he stayed to live, and because of that, we all did too. They buried her beside Ash and Cora, beneath the tree that had grown strong and wide, its roots reaching into every heart that had once passed through the doors of the post. Nathaniel carved the stone himself. It read, "June." She was born of the story, and she gave it back whole. Afterward, Caleb stood at the counter. The journal lay open, a blank page waiting. He picked up the pen, and he wrote, "The door is still open. The fire is still warm. The names are all still here. And I am not afraid, because someone stayed, and now it's me." And after Caleb, others followed. His children learned to walk on the same floorboards Ash once bled on, learned to read in the same patch of morning light that filtered through the lace-curtained windows above the flour sacks. They learned how to listen first, then speak, how to offer a hand without asking a name, how to sweep the porch as though preparing for someone they loved to arrive. Because someone always was. Caleb's youngest, a girl named Mercy, asked about the journals before she could spell her name. She traced her finger over the faded loops of Cora's handwriting, whispered the words aloud, like a hymn. She didn't want to be told the stories, she wanted to feel them. She slept curled with a quilt made of Ruth's old scraps. Under a window her father had repaired after a dust storm nearly pulled it from the hinges. She said the wind told her secrets. No one laughed. When Mercy was 10, a man arrived at the trading post just after dark, bleeding from the arm and too proud to ask for help. He carried nothing but a saddlebag and a broken compass. He collapsed on the porch. Caleb caught him before he hit the floor. Mercy ran for the stitching kit before her father had to ask. She watched him work, steady hands cleaning and wrapping. The man never spoke, not even a name. "He's like Ash," she whispered later, curled into her father's side as the fire burned low. Caleb nodded. "Maybe." "Will he stay?" "That's up to him." The man didn't stay. Not long. But he left a note in the ledger, tucked between pages near the first entries. It said, "I've seen the edge of the world and thought I'd fall from it, but I landed here instead. Thank you for being soft where life was hard." Mercy copied the note into the newest journal, wrote beneath it, "This place doesn't change people. It remembers them. It gives them room to become who they always were." She grew, as they all did, took to keeping the books, oiling the hinges, delivering bread to the outer farms that still relied on the post for staples and stories. She sang as she worked, not loud, but constant, a hum that threaded through the rafters, through the pages, through the hearts of those who came and stayed. When Mercy turned 18, Caleb handed her the oldest journal and a new one bound in blue leather. "This was Cora's," he said, "and this is yours." She didn't cry, just ran her fingers over the worn paper and said, "I know what to write." She did. Her first entry, "I do not know what it means to be brave, but I know what it means to stay. I know what it means to catch someone falling and let them rest. I know what it means to open a door without asking who waits on the other side. I have never seen Ash, but I see him everywhere, in the way we move, in the way we remember, in the way we never close what should stay open." That spring, the cottonwood bloomed early again. Always, when it mattered, it bloomed. Mercy opened the door one morning and found a girl standing on the edge of the porch, holding a letter in both hands, her shoes soaked through, eyes rimmed with dust, and something more than exhaustion. Mercy said nothing, just stepped aside. The girl walked in. That night she sat by the stove and read aloud from one of the journals. Her voice trembled at first, but Mercy sat with her, hand resting gently over hers, until she found the rhythm. The girl stayed for 2 months, then 3, then a year. Eventually she carved her name into the wall near the pantry, where all those who stayed longer than a season left their mark. One summer evening, Mercy stood outside beneath the cottonwood, a child in her arms, watching the sunset turn the sky to fire. Caleb stepped beside her, older now, hair gone silver. "Think we've done enough?" he asked. Mercy smiled. "We'll never be done, but we've done good." Behind them the house glowed. Voices rose in laughter. Bread cooled on the sill, and on the desk in the reading room, a new page lay open. Waiting, always waiting, because stories like these don't end. They stay, just like the people who write them. And so it went, year folding into year, like pages in the journals that lined the back wall of the reading room, spines worn smooth by generations of hands. Mercy's daughter, Claire, was born during the first hard rain of summer. Thunder cracked the sky open like a warning. But the baby came steady and strong, her cry rising above the storm like defiance. They wrapped her in the same wool blanket that had once swaddled June, that had once been draped over Ash's shoulders in the firelit dark of the storeroom. Nathaniel's old bench still sat beneath the cottonwood, now softened at the edges, initials carved deep into the grain. Ash's name, Cora's, Ruth's. New ones added every few years. It wasn't a memorial. It was a ledger, a living record of who had made this place what it was by staying. By the time Claire was old enough to walk, she was already known to every hand on the ranch and every traveler who passed through. They called her the post's shadow, always underfoot, always watching. She learned to sort tins by label color before she could read. She knew the rhythm of the coffee grinder by heart. And every night before bed she'd ask, "Can you read me a page?" Mercy would pick a journal at random. Some nights it was Ruth's carving notes. Some nights it was a memory of Henry racing the sunrise to deliver supplies to a flooded homestead. Sometimes it was Cora's sharp, careful script, recording the price of flour and the slow ache of grief side by side. "They never came back," Cora wrote once, "but I still boil an extra egg every morning, just in case someone does." Claire asked what that meant. "It means kindness doesn't keep a scorecard," Mercy answered. When Claire turned 10, she was given her own blank journal. She stared at the cover for a long time, then asked, "What if I don't know what to write?" Mercy kissed her forehead. "Write what you know now. You'll learn the rest by living." Her first entry was small. "I heard the wind move through the cottonwood. It sounded like a breath. I think it was Ash saying hello." That fall the post welcomed a man named Thomas, who came with a satchel of broken watches and a past he wouldn't speak of. He asked if he could trade work for a place to sleep. He fixed the porch steps, the hinges on the tool shed, a dozen other things no one had noticed were broken. He never told his story, not the whole of it. But one night, after the fire burned low and most of the house had gone quiet, he sat beside Claire in the reading room while she copied passages from a faded book into her journal. "Why do you do that?" he asked. She shrugged. "So I don't forget." He nodded once. By spring, Tomas had his own bunk, his own chores, his own smile that came easier with each day. He carved a small brass plaque and hung it beside the kitchen door. "It matters that you came." No one took it down. Time moved again. Children grew. Elders passed. The trade post expanded and shrank and grew again, like something breathing. When Mercy grew too tired to run it all, Claire stepped in. Not because she had to, because she couldn't imagine not doing it. She taught her own children to open the door before anyone knocked, to offer a blanket without waiting for a thank you, to know that a quiet place and a full meal could be the difference between someone giving up or starting over. She added a new section to the journals, a black-bound volume labeled Only, Letters Never Sent. It was for the things people needed to say, even if they never planned to send them. They left folded pages inside, unsigned or not, and Claire read them all, not to judge, just to bear witness. One letter read, "I never knew what love looked like. Then I saw a man rebuild a fence and tuck a flower into the hatband of a girl who wasn't his daughter. That was enough. That's what love is, quiet repair and beauty when no one's looking." Claire added it to her own journal that night. Wrote beneath it, "Love is the staying, the mending, the blooming after." On the 150th anniversary of Ash's arrival, Claire stood at the front porch as a line of people stretched from the road to the cottonwood. Some came with stories. Others came with silence. All came because they had heard, through letters, whispers, entries passed from hand to hand, that there was a place you could go when the road had taken too much from you. Claire opened the gate herself that morning, hugged strangers like kin, carried plates to old men too proud to ask for help, let children draw on the walls of the barn with chalk, their joy leaving brief, bright records of being alive. When the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned pink like the orchard in spring, she took out the newest journal, sat on the bench, wrote, "It has been 150 years since a quiet woman opened her door to a dying man and gave him a chance to live. He didn't bring wealth, only silence, but he brought his staying, and with it he built the beginning of us. We are not finished. We are not even close. As long as someone remembers to leave the porch light on, this story will have no end." And she believed it, because it was true. Years after Claire wrote that passage beneath the cottonwood, a storm came through that nearly tore the post from its roots. The wind howled for 2 days, screaming down from the north like something ancient and grieving. It lifted shingles from the roof, broke the east-facing windows, turned the chicken coop into matchsticks. But the house held, the journals held, the stories held. And when the rain stopped and the trees stopped bending and the silence finally fell again, the first thing Claire did was open the front door and breathe. The porch had buckled. The lantern that hung from the eave was shattered. Mud tracked through every room, but the place was still standing like it always had. She lit a candle, swept the steps, rehung the hand-painted sign that had fallen from its hook. Trade, rest, belong. Her hands ached, her back ached more, but she smiled. The next day, they rebuilt. Not just Claire, but everyone. The girl who'd arrived the month before with a broken engagement and a duffel bag full of clothes she no longer wanted helped repair the porch railing. Tomas replanked the floorboards and patched the barn roof with metal that rang in the wind like a bell. A boy named Jamie, barely 12, found the broken weather vane in the field and straightened it with bare hands and a hammer. No one asked who was in charge. They all were. They worked until their fingers blistered and their lungs burned. And when the sky turned orange and gold, they sat on the grass and passed bread and beans from hand to hand like communion. Claire stood in the doorway that evening and looked out at the group, tired, smiling, safe. She stepped inside, picked up the journal, wrote, "We lost the lantern. The porch groaned and gave in. The coop is gone, but not one story left, not one soul scattered. The storm did not break us. It only reminded us why we hold on. We are not the wood or the roof or the walls. We are the door that opens again the next morning. Always the next morning." Later that night, the girl with the broken engagement, her name was Ada, asked if she could read from the journals. Claire passed her one. Leather-bound and soft with age, Ada opened to a page and read aloud. He didn't speak when he came, not for a long time, but he stayed. And when someone stays long enough, you learn to understand the silence. That's how I knew I loved him, not by what he said, but by what he chose to keep giving. Everyone went quiet. Claire leaned against the doorframe. "That was Cora," she said. "The first keeper." Ada closed the journal and looked at her. "What happened to him?" Claire smiled. "He stayed, too." Another winter came and went, then another. Claire grew older, slower. She let others lift the sacks and scrub the floors, but she never stopped writing. Not once. She taught Ada how to tend the ledger, how to listen when someone said one thing but meant another. She taught Jamie how to mend seams and read the wind. She taught every child born beneath that roof how to write their name in the margins of something that mattered. When she could no longer write by hand, she dictated. And on the day her breath grew thin and her fingers curled like paper, she asked for the journal. Ada brought it to her, placed it on the quilt, held her hand. "Do you want me to write it down for you?" she asked. Claire nodded. She closed her eyes, then said, "The story is yours now. Tell it gently. Tell it true. Tell it even when it hurts. Tell it because it's the only way to keep us whole." Ada wrote it all down, word for word, then signed it. Claire, who stayed until the end. They buried her beneath the cottonwood. The bench now worn to silk. initials almost illegible. They planted sunflowers that year, dozens of them, so that the post would always have something reaching for light. And every spring, when the first blooms came, a new journal opened, new names written, new stories begun. And someone, always someone, stood in the doorway, looked out at the road, and whispered, "I'm home," because they were, because the place still stood, because someone had always chosen to stay, and because love, when tended, never runs out. On the morning of the centennial of Claire's birth, Mercy's great-granddaughter stood in the garden with her boots wet from dew and a journal pressed to her chest. Her name was Marin, and she was the youngest to take the keeper's post in over 5 generations. She was 22 with ash-blonde hair like ashes, Cora's silence in her bones, and a quiet that didn't mean fear, it meant she was listening. She'd listened her whole life, to the wind through the cottonwood, to the screen door creaking open and shut, to the stories whispered over supper, to the soft thump of journals closing in the stillness after midnight. She had learned early that you didn't inherit this place by blood. You inherited it by love, by care, by the willingness to stay even when you didn't have answers. And that was what she'd done. The journals were her altar, the porch her pulpit. She wrote with a deliberate hand, slow and sure, never rushed. She believed the truth took its time. On her first day as keeper, she wrote, "This is not a record, it's a living thing, a breath passed down through hands that held bread and books and each other. It's not mine, but I'll carry it, I'll add to it. I'll honor the ones who came before by giving it to the ones who haven't come yet." She kept her promise. She cataloged births, first words, burned biscuits, and dance nights when the lanterns stayed lit until every heel had scuffed the floor raw. She wrote about the way the cottonwood bloomed early the year baby Caleb died in his sleep, and how the whole porch went quiet for days except for the rocking chairs, which didn't stop once. She wrote about the woman who came with a wedding dress in her satchel and nowhere to wear it, who baked 12 pies that summer and found her own vows in the scent of cinnamon and berry. She wrote about the traveler who stayed for 2 nights, chopped enough wood for 2 winters, and left behind a single folded paper that read, "I was lost, but you never made me say it out loud." She wrote about Tomas's granddaughter who taught all the children how to dance barefoot in the rain. And she wrote about Ada, old and soft-voiced now, who held her hand when Marin first called herself the keeper, afraid she wasn't ready. "You don't have to know everything," Ada had said. "You just have to tell the truth." Marin did. One morning, a girl with hair like a crow's wing and a letter stitched into her coat showed up at the edge of the pasture. She was 17. Her name was Leah, and she had nothing left. Marin met her at the gate, said, "You hungry?" Leah nodded. Marin led her inside. Leah stayed. She helped with chores. She didn't speak much, but she picked up the broom without being asked, learned to knead bread, slept soundly for the first time in months under a quilt made before she was born. It was Leah who found Ash's original coat one day in the cellar, preserved in cedar and thyme. She brought it to Marin and said, "Can I fix it?" Marin blinked back something that wasn't quite tears. "Yes, please." Leah patched the seams, sewed the buttons with thread from her own pack. She wore it that winter when she took over feeding the horses. She looked like a shadow from a story stepping through frost and breath. And when people asked who she was, she said only, "I'm someone who stayed." Marin wrote that down. She wrote everything down, the good, the hard, the things people were too tired to say. She wrote, "We are not what we were, and that is right. But we are still the place. We are still the fire and the ledger and the bench and the bread. We are still the quiet. We are still the welcome. We are still the choosing. And we are still the staying." The journals filled. Another shelf was built in the reading room, then another. And when a man from the Historical Society wrote and asked if he could come catalog the collection, Marin sent him a jar of peach preserves and a note that said, "We already have keepers." And when he showed up anyway, she handed him a broom and said, "Sweep the porch, then we'll talk." He stayed 3 weeks, never took a single journal, but he added a page to one. He wrote, "I came for research. I left with something I can't name. Maybe it was grace, maybe it was memory, maybe it was rest. All I know is that I hadn't known I was tired until you let me stop running." They added his name to the bench. Time passed again, as it always does. People came, people left, people stayed. Children traced the grain of wood under their fingertips and asked who ash was, and Marin told them not with facts, but with feeling, with bread pulled from the oven, with the swing of the door on quiet hinges, with the hush that came when someone wrote the first line of a journal they hadn't known they'd been born to fill. Marin grew old, the garden grew wilder, the cottonwood's branches bowed lower with the weight of generations. But still it stood. And one spring morning, with the orchard in bloom and the wind carrying the scent of basil and old stories, Marin walked out to the bench, sat down, opened the newest book, and wrote, "I was the keeper for 52 years. I watched 1,000 stories begin and a few end. I buried 3 dogs, 6 chickens, and more good people than I can count. I've forgotten the sound of silence, but I've never forgotten what it feels like to be loved here. This is the last entry I'll write with my own hand. The next one belongs to whoever walks through the door tomorrow and knows, without needing to be told, that they've found something sacred." She closed the book, left it on the bench, and went inside to rest. And sure enough, the next morning, the bell over the door rang, and someone new stepped in, hungry, hollow, hopeful, and the door stayed open, just as it always had. The new keeper arrived with sand in her boots and the desert sun still clinging to her skin. Her name was Elise, though she didn't offer it at first. She simply walked in, took one look around the trading post, the journals, the stove, the quiet hum of people who had already chosen her without needing to say so, and sat down in the chair by the window like it had been waiting for her. It had. She didn't ask for food. She didn't ask for shelter. She just stayed. For a while she didn't speak much. She helped in the garden, rising early, her hands deep in dirt before most others had even stirred. She brought water to the porch each morning. She swept the stoop in silence. She sang under her breath sometimes, songs no one recognized, half-tunes that made the wind slow as it passed through. It was Ruth's great-grandson, Micah, who first handed her a journal. "She left it for you," he said. Elise stared down at the book. A thin, hand-written note was tucked inside the front cover. It said, "You don't need to know what to say. Just say it." It was signed with one word, Marin. That night Elise lit a candle, sat on the bench beneath the cottonwood, opened the journal. She didn't write her name. She didn't tell her story, and she just wrote, "It's quiet here, not the kind of quiet that comes before a storm, the kind that comes after healing. I think this is what peace feels like." After that, she wrote every day. Sometimes it was one line, sometimes 2 pages. Sometimes it was just, "Still here." She stayed through the first snow, through the spring thaw, through the long summer heat that cracked the porch boards and made the candles slump in their jars. She stayed through birthdays and funerals, and that night in June when the sky lit up with the longest lightning anyone could remember, and everyone gathered in the reading room with the windows wide and hearts thundering together. She was the one who rebuilt the chicken coop after the roof caved in. She was the one who carried Ruth's great-great-great-granddaughter down the road when her fever spiked. She was the one who stood outside the night the wind blew the pantry door open and whispered into the dark, "You don't scare me." Elise never said what she was running from, No one asked, because staying doesn't require a reason, only a choice. Over time, her pages changed. Less ache, more wonder. She wrote, Micah planted sunflowers by the fence line. They turned their heads before dawn this morning, reaching for something I couldn't see. I think hope moves like that, quiet, slow, always forward. She wrote, Someone asked me today if I plan to leave. I laughed. Not because the question was funny, but because I realized I don't know how to go anymore. I only know how to stay. She wrote, I saw a girl today sitting where I used to, back straight, eyes hollow, fingers clenched. I handed her bread. She didn't speak, but she didn't leave. That's how it starts. And one day, years after she first arrived, Elise woke to find a small box on the porch. Inside, a folded slip of paper. It read, When you are ready, pass the journal forward. The story won't end. But someone new must hold the pen. She sat with that paper all day, and that night she walked into the reading room, opened the newest volume, and wrote, This place is not mine. I only held it for a time, and in that time I stitched together pieces of myself that I thought were lost. I loved people I didn't know I could love. I forgave things I hadn't yet spoken aloud. I healed. Not because someone told me to, because someone let me. She closed the book, set it on the counter, then turned to the girl at the hearth, 16, silent, new, and said, It's yours now. The girl's hands trembled when she picked it up. But she didn't let go. Outside, the wind carried the scent of lilacs through the orchard. The cottonwood rustled softly, and far beyond the hill, the stars blinked into place like punctuation. The story continued, because it always would, because someone always stayed. That girl's name was Ansel, a quiet name, spoken like a thought. No one knew if it was the one she was born with or the one she'd chosen on the long road toward the post. But when Elise said, It's yours now, and placed the journal in her hands, Ansel nodded once, like she'd been waiting her whole life for that sentence, that moment, that weight of ink and trust and time. She didn't write that first night. She held the journal on her lap, tracing her fingertips across the edges of the leather cover, as if reading the ghosts inside. She sat by the window until the sky turned to pale ash and the candles guttered out. When morning came, she stood, slipped the journal into her satchel, and walked out into the orchard. It was spring again. It always seemed to be spring when things began. The trees were just starting to bloom. Small pale petals curled into the edges of the branches like they too weren't sure if they were ready. Ansel sat under the old cottonwood, cross-legged in the grass, and opened the journal. The first words she wrote were, I don't know how to stay yet, but I want to. And with that, the story continued. She learned quickly how to restock the shelves, how to sweep the porch before the sun rose, how to grind coffee just right, how to sit beside someone without speaking until they realized they weren't alone. She had a gift for finding the one loose nail, the one cracked tile, the one quiet person who needed to be seen. Her strength wasn't in her voice. It was in her noticing. And people came, as they always did. A man who'd lost his wife to the sea and had wandered inland with guilt stitched into every step. A woman who hadn't spoken to her sister in 18 years but brought her baby here anyway because someone once told her, they'll help you remember. A boy who hadn't said a word in 4 months but sat with Ansel under the cottonwood one evening and simply said, My name's Theo. She wrote their stories down, not like chapters, but like breaths. Today the boy said his name, just his name, but it filled the room like light. The woman cried when the baby laughed for the first time. She said it sounded like forgiveness. The man planted marigolds by the pantry window, said his wife always liked them. Now we all do. She never asked where they came from. She only asked, Are you hungry? And if they were, she fed them. Years passed. The post shifted around her. Children grew. People stayed. People left. Sometimes they returned, sometimes they didn't. But the porch was always swept, the journals were always open, and someone always slept beneath the same stars Ash had once bled under. One autumn, Ansel woke to find the orchard burning with color. She stood at the window and watched the leaves fall in soft spirals to the ground. She opened the journal, now nearly full, and wrote, "I didn't know that staying would look like this. Not a chain, but a root. Not stillness, but steadiness. Not silence, but listening. Every season teaches me something. And I keep writing it down because that's how I remember it all matters." That same day a young girl arrived on foot, cheeks red from wind, boots muddy to the knees. Ansel opened the door. The girl didn't speak. She only held out a small paper smudged with soot that read, "My mother said this is where people begin again." Ansel took her in, fed her stew, let her sleep by the fire. In the morning she handed the girl a pencil and said, "Write your name. That's the first thing we give back to you." The girl wrote Mira. Ansel wrote that down too. And when the final page of her journal came near, Ansel sat beneath the cottonwood and wrote in small, careful script, "This is what we know. You do not need to be whole to be welcomed. You do not need to be certain to stay. You only need to arrive with enough breath left in you to whisper, 'I'm here.' And we will answer, 'So are we.'" She closed the journal, left it on the shelf. And when Mira came into the reading room that night, eyes wide and a voice small, Ansel looked up from the hearth and said, "It's yours now." And the story went on.